thank you for everybody out there who's joining. It's a pleasure to talk to you and present to you again. It's an exciting time, a changing time. And what Chris and I thought would be hopefully beneficial for you is to talk a little bit about what we have seen the last several weeks and months since we work in this new normal. And I would like to kick it off a little bit with the Matrix42 perspective, and then hand over to Chris about a very important topic, which is related obviously to security, specifically on the endpoint. Yeah, and then we wrap it up. We thought it's probably beneficial if we discuss a few questions. So let me then jump straight in and let's see if that works, if I have control. Yes, shaping the digital work of tomorrow. I would really like to start briefly with the status quo. As you know, and as you've heard from my team during this conference, I mean, we have the pleasure and the honor to serve more than 5,000 customers worldwide, and a lot of our customers and you have been challenged with COVID-19 and the impact on digital work. And I thought it's probably beneficial to talk briefly about what we have seen and how we address it and how we help customers. So I think one thing is for sure that COVID-19 has changed digital work forever. So we see that there is a new normal out there, and it is very likely that this new normal remains. Digital work, specifically working from home, is not an exception anymore. It's currently the norm, and it probably will be part of our digital work style forever. They're more intense than before the COVID-19 crisis. So as you also see, I'm also presenting this out of my home office and to share a few thoughts about the latest weeks. So if we look at COVID-19, one thing that we have seen is how obviously customers reacted to that crisis. And I would separate this actually in three phases. Number one is when the worldwide shutdowns, economic shutdowns occurred, and companies were shutting down their offices. It was a kind of panic phase. The good news is there were companies obviously that have invested in digital work and digital workspace management many years ago, and it was easier for them to send their staff to home office. We as Matrix42, we operate with more than 400 people worldwide. For us, it was actually quite easy to send 100% of our employees to remote work offices. But not for everybody it was that easy. But during this panic phase, it was all about business continuity. Let's make sure that my employees can work from home. And we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of workarounds that were needed. I mean, we've seen customer scenarios where all of a sudden we had phone calls that customers had to deploy thousands of new devices and also provide somehow security for those devices overnight, literally. But we've seen, unfortunately, a lot of workarounds during this business continuity phase. And we helped obviously also in this phase, but the phase that was then briefly after that first panic phase, when people were able to work more remotely, something that I call optimized phase. And in some of these scenarios, don't take this too serious with 11 to 30 days. It's a lot of companies are still in this optimization phase. Yeah. So all of a sudden it was more about, hey, this is not going away in the next couple of days. So this will be on for several weeks, even maybe months. And going forward. So then security came on the radar, right? It was not just about business continuity, it was about making sure that users stay productive, but at the same time secure. To give you simple examples, we've seen customers sending their staff to home office and ask them to work with their personal devices, but have never had a bring your own program or never thought about what that means. Yeah, so we talk about protecting also devices that are not part of the organization, yeah, and other things like how do I optimize actually access to applications and to data, especially when the device is not in the office and when the device or the application and data is accessed by personal devices. But where I want to lead to is that what we currently see a lot from customers is that they take a step back now and think about what is the right thing to do going forward. How can we improve digital workspace management overall? I mean, more like a strategic topic. And I guess we all agree that third phase should be actually at a starting point, but due to COVID-19, this was not possible. But if you look at where the focus is on the strategic phase, it's how do you balance productivity and security? How do you balance that out long term, that the device and the workspace is independent or the workspace is independent of device and location? But how do I make sure that the employee does not feel that security, for instance, is in the background and helps me? So that phase is a lot about employee experience. So to finalize this, before I hand over to Chris, we can see 3 buckets that you should focus on when it comes now to improve a longer term workspace strategy. Number 1 is we all need to be realistic. The work styles have changed forever because of COVID-19. And one thing that we see here is actually we have 3 generations that work together in a company, at least 3 generations. And all of these generations have different work styles. They need a different way, probably how you provide applications, data, and also how you manage security for those generations. But we need to address all of them. Number 2 is there's a lot of new technology out there, right? And that is increasing and creating more complexity, whether it's things that I wear on my body, like a smartwatch, even IoT-based devices, and also stuff that I have in my home office. So that creates more complexity. But where I want to lead to is we also see, especially during COVID-19, more risks. And that has 2 dimensions. Number 1 is the legal risks, because that was not a discussion that we had in the last several weeks with most customers. How do I make sure that I'm GDPR compliant, that my data security policies are in place, etc.? Because it was all about business continuity and making sure that people can work. But the risk that is there for a very long time, and COVID-19 is a good example for that, because it's a human virus, the cyber risk, the malwares, and that increased significantly from our point of view due to COVID-19, because also the bad guys are trying to leverage and utilize the situation, because more devices out there and more access points to your corporate network automatically mean more risk surfaces and more attack surfaces. And to summarize, maybe what I think what we can learn from COVID-19, from the human virus, is basically 2 things. Number 1 is the virus is so dangerous because you don't know that you have it. So you have it in your system and you spread it without knowing. Guess what? A lot of cyber viruses work the same way. And the second thing is, I think what we also can learn from COVID-19, shutting down and a shutdown is not a solution. So same analogy we can use for cyber risks. So the last point that I want to make is COVID-19, from our point of view, what we've seen in the last several weeks is the acceleration for digital work. So I'll repeat that because that's important, the acceleration of the acceleration. So if you don't have your digital workspace strategy prepared and security prepared, now is the right time to do so. So with that, I would like to hand over actually to Chris, because that summarizes what I've just said. Stay flexible in terms of working from home, plan ahead, but surely focus on security. And it's an absolute pleasure to have Chris on board today with us to talk about security. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver.
So I'm going to
thank you to everyone
pass
else.
the mouse on so that now, Chris, you got control over my computer. And
Great.
There you go.
Perfect. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. Yeah, so I've been covering endpoint security and mobile security for the past 10 years at Forrester, right? And I've never seen things shift so quickly in terms of the need to secure remote work, right? With the sudden rise in telecommuting that you mentioned, right, due to the ongoing crisis, you need to make sure that your employees are protected outside of the office. And right, never before have you had to really deal with so many insecure devices interacting with your enterprise assets, right? Whether these be mobile, traditional, or consumer IoT devices. And several years ago, to help combat the rise in consumer and employee-owned devices, or maybe more specifically, manage and unmanaged assets, right? Forrester created the zero trust model of network architecture to help identify isolation levels and appropriate ways to eliminate static determinations of trust, right? That are just so prevalent in IT and security. And I'll talk more about this through my presentation, but to start off, I think it's useful to just show at a high level the risks posed by unmanaged devices and how they're rising in terms of priority for security decision makers. It's clearly a C-level problem today, right? In fact, Forrester's annual security survey with 3,800 security decision makers shows that concern over these unmanaged devices, is a top priority, along with data protection concerns over those devices. And this was before the crisis, but it's obviously, accelerated and been augmented, right, due to the rise in home work. And with over 20 billion unmanaged devices expected by 2024 and 1 trillion by 2030, right, the attack surface is only growing. And the main issue is the total number of areas exposed to sensitive data, right? The total attack surface, of the average organization is rapidly expanding and really has been for decades. And we call all these areas of the business which can be exploited its attack surface, or maybe in other words, the total sum, of exploitable IT surfaces that can be used as conduits of attack, right? And this starts with corporate controlled IT, the corporate controlled IT devices or environment, but extends out to less controlled assets, such as rogue devices, BYOD, social media, and also, third parties, which you have no control over. And I've shown this here in the slide as, concentric rings starting with core IT infrastructure, and with shadow IT just outside of this area of control. And in fact, shadow IT represents, a pretty significant problem for enterprises. And of course, these are devices and apps that employees use that are unsanctioned by IT, but may be useful in getting work done, right? That's key. And our survey data shows that 39% of those using shadow IT resources do so because they feel like it's the most effective way to get work done. As security and IT professionals, we all have to have a strategy that reduces the risk of attacks coming in through less controlled assets. But unfortunately, many just have simply layered more and more security technologies on to address this. And, this isn't the solution. So what's the outcome, right, of all these vulnerabilities? Well, it probably won't come as much of a surprise to any of you that, we're seeing increasing data breaches, right? Well over half of organizations dealing with data breaches, are dealing with them on a yearly basis. And I have a background in healthcare cybersecurity, and I can tell you, healthcare professionals are especially, at risk given the increasing amount of ransomware targeting medical facilities lately. And what about malicious insiders, right? We often trust users, but as the creator of Zero Trust here at Forrester back in 2010, John Kindevog used to like to say, people aren't packets, right? You can't statically assign trust, in the same way that you do assets. In fact, you need to eliminate all of your trust assumptions across the board. And this is really foundational to what I'll be talking about for the rest of my presentation. So when I started talking about zero trust in 2010, with John, the major issue then, as it is today, is the decreasing efficacy, of the perimeter-based security model. It's not tenable anymore to have a trusted and untrusted network, right? Networks are too broadly laid out to protect with a network security strategy alone. Right? Data moves in and out of those controlled and uncontrolled areas of the network, or between those concentric rings that I used to represent the attack surface earlier. Trust is often given, but it's static in the sense that once a device is allowed onto a network, it's often given just a free rein to rejoin the network in the future without analysis as to whether it should be trusted, right? It's just simply trusted. And many both inside and outside the security industry have been talking about the zero trust model, mostly due to the US government's adoption of the strategy, and subsequent NIST guidance on the topic last year. And I'll get into a little bit more detail in a subsequent slide. And as I mentioned before, many organizations just simply layer more and more IT and security tools to address the problem, right? But this isn't the solution, right? This just adds to the complexity and overall expense. And how we like to call it here at Forrester is, it adds to the friction, right? Friction for both the security professionals triaging, and working with IT to respond to attacks, as well as IT who try to, remediate in a timely fashion. Data from multiple surveys show that the average enterprise has to deal with 6 or more security agents, per endpoint. And this is even worse in larger enterprises, where, if you have over 10,000 nodes in your environment, you're likely to have 12 or more agents to deal with. This clearly is not the solution. So one trend we're seeing to help address this at Forrester is the reduction of agents through the adoption of suites, right? And I've been covering endpoint security suites for many years. And for the first time, we're starting to see a decrease in adoption of the large security-focused suites in favor of products like UEM that integrate security, directly into the infrastructure. And I have our latest Forrester survey data here. And you'll see while security suites are still, on top in terms of adoption overall, adopting more than UEM, the trend is towards increasing UEM and decreasing security-centric suites. We expect many of the prevention-oriented security technologies to eventually come under the control of IT operations in the next 3 to 5 years. And UEM vendors are well positioned to shepherd this integration, since risk identification ideally covers both behaviors of an endpoint as well as the configuration. And let's dive into this a little bit more. So, why the integrated approach, right? Having both management and security, it's is especially useful when deploying enterprise apps and resources to employee devices, right? Employee-owned devices. And it also reduces the level of friction between the security and IT teams, right? From a remediation workflow perspective. It also helps limit malware propagation on employee-owned devices, right? That might be being used right now in remote work scenarios. And this is ideal when isolation is enforced between the consumer and the enterprise apps on those devices. The added visibility into endpoint configuration is useful to security professionals, right? And it helps them prioritize alerts based on things like IT hygiene or patch status, right? And this can help ultimately improve time to detection, right? And prevent data breaches. And with the increases in efficiency, it can also aid in remediation costs and ultimately lower agent fatigue with fewer agents to be managed. So let's do a quick poll question here. So everyone should see this in the sidebar there. How would you rate the level of integration between your security and IT management tools today?
I'm very curious, Chris, about that result. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I have a feeling, I know we have similar data here at Forrester. I have a feeling, I'm guessing, let's say 35, 40%. See how far.
We've activated the survey, and let's see what answers pop in. We have roughly 100 attendees in the session right now, and let's see what the mix is. So
give everyone a minute here.
Keeps popping in.
There's also an organization size angle to this too, right? The larger the organization, the more likely you have to have siloed IT and security teams, right?
So yet only like 25% of the attendees have made up their mind on what they're going to click.
Okay.
So here we go.
Let's see.
Get some
Let's see the
movement here.
results.
Shall we end this with like 75 seconds yet? All right.
Yeah, I think that
so
it is about getting a snapshot, right, Boris? So let's see.
Right. Okay. So let's close this, and here's what came out.
Wow, better than I expected.
We'll have it satisfying, right? So.
Yeah, if you add up, yeah, good, very good, not bad. I mean, seems like your audience is a little bit more forward-leaning than average.
You know, Chris, what could be the case? I mean, obviously, we are a UEM vendor also, as you know, and we are, and that's the reason why I like your story so much, because we see it exactly like you just explained it. And we communicate this to our customers a lot, right? That this security and unified endpoint management should go hand in hand. And we have also a lot of customers in the call. So very good. Good to see.
Yeah, encouraging. Yeah, so let's, just in time's sake, I want to make sure we hit that 45-minute mark. we have quite a bit to discuss as well, Oliver, you and I. So hopefully we can get through all the Q&A, but we'll move on. Great. So now let's talk about a framework that you can all use to guide your integration strategy. This, of course, being the zero trust model, right? The major issue, over the past several years has been the decreasing efficacy, again, of those perimeter-based security models, right? As I mentioned before, it's not useful to really have that trusted and untrusted network. So we have here, a representation that we use to, to just show the overall model, what we call ZTX or Zero Trust X. So we've gone beyond just the network. Now we include devices, users, people, workloads, right? All centered around protecting sensitive data. And fundamental to this approach is having visibility and control, over all the assets in your organization that have access to sensitive data, right? With orchestration, things like AI, like you were talking, like we were talking about earlier, to help orchestrate and automate technology and operation workflows, and tie them all together. And we often get asked, right, what technology enables zero trust? Well, that's the wrong way to look at it, right? Zero trust is a philosophy that has implications for every security layer, right? No single product will deliver ZTX. It's really a combination of multiple products and layers, beyond just the endpoint, right? To deliver security based on actual risk, right? Point in time risk, with no automatic assumptions of trust, right? A way to think about it is, even just cyber threats as a whole, right? You should assume that you've already been compromised. You simply don't know it yet, right? This is really a necessary mindset in today's hostile environment. So where do you start, right? What does this all mean? Well, first, there are some fundamental requirements to look for when choosing security products aligned with this philosophy. A central tenet to zero trust is having coordination and orchestration, right? Like I mentioned before. But specifically on your endpoint, you want to have this orchestration across threat prevention, detection, and response activities. And this is really made a lot easier when you have tools that integrate. For example, when you have a device security solution that indicates a high-risk behavior on that device, access to certain enterprise applications and data should be reduced or pared back, right, until the risk returns to a baseline. This really requires interaction, with, again, multiple products, and you don't want to be stuck with poor integrations that add little value, right? So it's important to do due diligence on all of your new purchases as a general rule. And you also want to be able to deploy quickly with little or no additional tech, right? If the security product takes weeks or months to implement, right, it's unlikely that it's going to be universally deployed, across all of your devices, especially as time goes on. Easy deployment really is the point here. Easy deployment is key. And your security should be consistently applied across all devices, right? Any device that has access to company resources, right? Any browser or mobile, whether it's owned by the company or not. And as data spreads across the extended enterprise into blind spots or untrusted network segments, you need to make sure that your security control extends to that edge, right? Wherever it may be. And multiple isolation levels aligned with device, network, user, and data risk, right, needs to be, ultimately implemented, right? You want to preserve also that native user experience, right? And having different isolation levels helps to, to implement appropriate levels of risk based on what you're actually, what your actual risk is at that point in time. And you also don't want to upset, your brethren over at IT ops, right? This will hold back adoption and compliance will suffer because ultimately users will work around IT if the experience isn't optimal due to your security, maybe inappropriate levels of security control. Also, phishing and web-based attacks are really the top vectors today into the organization, and you can't ignore web and email threats, right? These have to be accounted for in your risk assessments with appropriate levels to mitigate those risks, appropriate levels of control. And finally, you need forensics, right? You need to be continually evaluating risk through behavioral forensics and threat detection, right? Depending on your level of expertise, right? This is really fundamental to informing what those appropriate levels of access should be for your devices in real time. All right, so before going into some recommendations, let's just quickly talk about some real-world examples that might highlight how Zero Trust can help secure your home workers. So first up, we have enterprise data theft from a personal device. Considering how many people are using personal devices today to access company resources, I think this is an increasingly common scenario. So in this example, we see attackers leveraging a consumer app to deliver an exploit that gets root access to the device hardware, right? And we're assuming in this case the device doesn't have hardware isolation or software isolation, logical isolation rather, between the OS and its apps. And the attacker in this case takes advantage of that lack of isolation or segmentation between the personal and corporate apps and uses the exploited hardware, to pull data from the enterprise app. Right? And this gives them free rein to steal data either stored locally or moving through the network. And this is, a more advanced attack, but it's one we're seeing several times, both publicly and in conversations with clients. And the point here is, if the device had better segmentation between the enterprise and corporate apps, as well as, with the underlying hardware, it would have been much harder for the attacker to accomplish. And another common scenario that we're seeing a lot today is, phishing, right? This is probably the most common method of infiltration today by attackers. And we're seeing a lot of spoofed login pages for employee company resources, for example, right? Tricking employees to enter their credentials and then stolen by the attacker. Now, while that initial link may be blocked by a network, tool, network security tool, it's not, we're talking about home worker scenarios here, right? And you're not always going to be behind that corporate firewall or security proxy, right? So this is where a lot of security solutions will fall flat, right? Ultimately, you need to include user behavior analysis to identify when trusted, users may be acting in an untrusted manner, right? Such as the case when an attacker has stolen employee credentials and is attempting to move through the network. As long as you're tracking that context, right, that might be gathered from a UEM provider, right? As the attacker pivots to other devices or apps, your response ideally should be automatic and step down access to sensitive resources, as needed. And this should occur, as that user's digital behavior changes and seemingly becomes more malicious, right, automatically. All right, so before Oliver and I discuss some home worker related questions, here are a few high-level recommendations for all of you at home. first and foremost, embrace the positive security model, right? Don't look necessarily for only the malicious, assuming everything else is good. This is the negative security model, and it's proven itself pretty ineffective over the past few years, right? Isolation and segmentation doesn't have to just be at the network level, right? It's beneficial at the device, hardware, the app, and data levels as well. And I'll say it again, right? The bottom line is don't assume trust, right? Whether it means an executable, an app, user, or a general privilege level. Second, you want to have the right endpoint security controls to immediately apply isolation in real time, right? Think about ransomware. Reporting on ransomware is pretty useless unless it was automatically blocked in the first place. And this brings me to number 3, right? Use device management and configuration to inform risk, right? And correlate this with real-time behaviors, or look for a solution that does this automatically. Ultimately, once you understand your environment, you can identify and then apply appropriate isolation levels based on that identified risk level. And last but not least, definitely bring all of your analysis together using a trusted partner to correlate data, network, and user behavioral trends, right? And this can help inform security enforcement beyond just the device in areas such as network and workloads, for example. So ultimately, your journey will require many small steps, and this all begins with shedding your trust assumptions, right? Getting rid of them and working with your colleagues, in IT ops and security, right? To reduce those silos and build out a strategy that increases the friction for the attacker, not your employees or your admin. All right, so with that, let's get on to some Q&A.
Yeah. Very good points, Chris. And let's move over then to some questions that we would like to discuss. Let's see if I can.
Who's taking control of this now? Is it you, Oliver? Is it Chris?
I can do it. I can do it. That makes sense.
So let me get you. You still have mouse control. Feel free to click around.
Very good. So what we thought is hopefully beneficial for you is that Chris and I talk briefly about key questions that we hear all the time, and especially during this COVID-19 crisis. And I think the first one is really about the future of endpoint security, right, Chris? And obviously, I have a view that is much more flavored from a vendor perspective, but let's maybe start with your view on it. You touched on some of these items already in your presentation. So I know you hear this question all the time, right, from clients. So what does the future of endpoint security look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so there are several trends that we could talk about here, right? Yeah, first, I think I've alluded to this already, but clearly security and IT emerging, right? When it comes to the endpoint infrastructure, and there are so many different endpoint types and form factors, it really doesn't make sense to keep applying more agents and requiring dedicated staff to manage all of this. So merging the two, I think, is really one of the high-level future directions, right? And this helps reduce that complexity that I talked about, and allows you to just uniformly apply security across just more devices, more of those edge devices specifically, right? Regardless of ownership. Second, I definitely think you're gonna start seeing more native security adoption, right? So these are gonna be security features that are built into the OS, right? Like antivirus, firewall, stuff like this, right? Defender, Gatekeeper, Apple. Yeah, detection technologies like EDR are definitely hot right now, but I think the long-term efficacy and overall, precision of these tools will increase to the point where they'll close that loop between detection and response, effectively making them, a de facto prevention technology, right? As they become automatic in their response, with just more context built into that from things like UEM, right? It will increase that precision to the point where you could feel confident to allow it to automatically take action without, an admin having to validate a alert, for example. And I think there'll still be a need for that more advanced detection use case, but more and more you'll see MDR kind of managed detection and response fill that gap. Yeah, I mean, really at that point, I think EDR will just become another form of prevention, right? Just going way beyond traditional AV. And also, related to this, maybe accelerating it will be just a broadening of scope with endpoint security technologies, right? Today they're more focused on files and executables, but soon we'll see more user behavior getting correlated, with process-based behavior, and not just on specific siloed device types, right? You'll see that it'll become the norm to have correlation across all devices, including IoT, mobile, workloads, network, of course, and also the endpoint, traditional endpoints. And yeah, I mean, just maybe one last one. I think longer term we'll see agentless endpoint security start to come into the mix more, right? Covering.
Very good point.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it already, right, at a certain level, but they're definitely limited in their capabilities. I think long term you'll see more advanced, detection use cases covered by agentless endpoint security. That will require some changes to the OS, but that's probably a topic for another conversation. Oliver, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, if I may add a few to those. I mean, if I recall the conversations that I have with our customers, I mean, you touched one that is probably most important. I hear always the discussion and the question about reduced complexity, and that means unification, right? So this notion of IT operations merging together with cybersecurity teams and then having a solution that provides me end-to-end use cases is probably the most heard demand at the moment. And then to make this a little bit concrete, I mean, scenarios like, I don't know, when I manage a device, it is per se maybe a little bit more secure than an unmanaged device, and simple hygiene processes like patch management helps together with malware detection and response. And what I mean with automation, I mean, we've built use cases like you deploy an application through our UEM solution, and then per se with a kind of a dynamic whitelisting approach, we provide access to the application, and everything else is then perceived as untrusted. So, but that is reduction of complexity because you don't have to think about it anymore. It's part of the management use case, and then security is actually built in. So it's what I mean with that is unification. It's built-in security that is not in the way of the user and the endpoint. And one thing that you also touched on is a lot about user behavior, contextual. Yeah, so it's not just about the threat anymore. It's about how users, what they do on the devices, and is that malicious? Does that somehow smell malicious, or is this actually legitimate behavior? So this is like the stuff that we hear at the moment, mostly about unification, get complexity out of the way. I like actually your slide also about the amount of agents. I mean, we have customers, enterprise customers that have 10, 15 more agents on the device. So it's obviously that this creates challenges, right? In terms of management, but also security. So there's a strong need of unification, I guess. Good. So let's maybe jump to the second question, Chris, and that is, are attackers modifying their tactics given the global pandemic? Yeah, we touched a little bit on it, but maybe you start first again. What's your view on this?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think in some ways, yes, in other ways, no, right? We're definitely seeing opportunistic attacks, right? Where COVID or COVID-related services are being specifically targeted, such as the case with hospitals and specifically providers and suppliers focused on nephrology, neurology, and of course, emergency medicine. For example, in our recent interviews of 16 healthcare systems as part of my soon-to-be published endpoint or medical device security wave, we found 2 US hospitals who saw attackers delivering ransomware through virtual care-related medical devices. Ransomware was the intent in both of those situations, but pretty scary, right? In one instance, the attacker leveraged a default password in a remote patient monitoring device, or RPM, to gain access to the hospital's back end. Luckily, in that case, the attack was stopped before any patient harm or clinical disruption occurred. In several other cases, hospitals have reported increases in ransomware since the crisis began. Actually, just recently, it was discovered Europe's Fresenius group had a ransomware attack. This was public, that affected their IT network, which likely had several dialysis and renal assist devices connected to the network. This is since up to, I think, about 50% of COVID-related ICU patients develop kidney issues or kidney disease. This ransomware attack definitely took advantage of that increased criticality. We've also seen a lot of phishing, right? A lot of phishing using COVID bulletins, treatments, fake WHO announcements, and also especially scary contact tracing initiatives, right? Nation states have also increased their focus on stealing IP related to COVID vaccine and drug research, right? But essentially, none of this is new in the sense that the tactics are changing, right? The tactics are the same. It's just the focus and the content has changed.
I completely agree. Maybe to add to that, what we've also had customers approaching us a lot of more kind of attacks, obviously, that try to leverage more the personal device type of scenarios, because a lot of customers were forced to ask their employees to work with their personal devices that are not fully protected. And then things like Wi-Fi attacks, phishing you mentioned, fileless attacks, right? But as you said, I think that's not new, right? It's just maybe used a little bit more intense at the moment, because more people are working remotely and more attack surfaces out there. So just watching time a little bit, because I know Boris will shut us off the mic if we're going beyond quarter to the hour. So let's go through the third one. What are some of the security challenges inherent in remote work? What's your view on this, Chris?
Yeah, so I think the problem is really twofold. In remote work scenarios, you generally have to protect both managed and unmanaged devices. With the managed, or those that your organization has provided to the employee and can control, right, to a certain degree. Aside from the general malware and exploit protection requirements, you need to be able to ensure the device has a secure connection, right, while also making sure it's not connecting to compromised access points. Also consumer devices like IoT and employee-owned devices might be sharing the network and can get compromised, but you can't simply inspect those in the same way that you can with devices on your corporate network, right? Patching can be more difficult off network, and this is where SaaS-based solutions can help. But really, the privacy issues as well come into play here. You don't want to be probing the employee's network to try to find those malicious devices. So it can be quite tricky. You need a solution that can adapt. And then with unmanaged devices, or the employee-owned devices that might be accessing corporate resources, they have all the same as above, but with additional complications, right? That corporate resources will be sharing the same underlying device as consumer apps and hardware, right? Exploits in that underlying hardware can't be as easily detected, and they can move between the two, right? If you don't have proper isolation between them. The bottom line is you can't expect the same level of control and visibility into those remote assets as you enjoy with managed devices on your own network. What do you think?
Totally agree. I totally agree. I mean, again, I hear a lot about data, actually, and protect my data on personal devices, but also simple things. I mean, not simple things, but new things. I mean, everybody is using, obviously, collaboration tools now. I mean, Teams is a good example. We use it also internally. It's a great tool. I think from 10 million daily users up to almost 80 million per day. But you can also exchange data there through these channels. And if you do that with an unprotected, unsecured device, you have a challenge. So in addition to the technical challenges, I highly recommend during this now second or third phase in COVID also that the listeners should also have a look what that means in terms of GDPR, right? I mean, nobody had this on the radar, and for the remote working side, actually. I mean, besides the companies that did remote work quite intensively, but we've seen now many customers that where remote work is pretty new to them. So yeah, so maybe jump on, I mean, one that I skipped this fourth one, but I would like to hear your thoughts really about this fifth one. How can security and management work better together to protect employees today, Chris?
Yeah, it's a good one here. It's clear from our research integrating, the two, right, integrating IT and security infrastructure, leads to less friction and better efficiency, right, as well as this better overall protection. The two have to come together and identify a common strategy, right, to improve threat response workflows, while also serving both teams' needs, right, and requirements, compliance requirements, for example. At the end of the day, an organization's security and IT teams really need to work together to identify common goals, right? They are different in some ways, but in many ways they have very similar requirements, right? These include reducing time to containment when new threats appear, identifying appropriate patching SLAs, identifying alert and overall just better prioritization of tasks, and for example, based on measures of risk. And eliminating really as much of the attack surface as possible should be a common goal, right? Using proactive measures like configuration changes and ensuring proper IT hygiene. But this can't happen without the right technology, right? Both teams really have expressed a lot of frustration to me, with inadequate tools at the top of the list, right? That, inadequate tools that don't integrate with one another and reinforce those silos. Really at the end of the day, you need to find tools that serve both the security and IT teams' needs.
I can only say one word to this, Chris. Amen. Yeah, seriously, because frankly, I mean, we as you know, we provide a platform that provides this end-to-end best-of-suite platform approach where security, UEM, but also one thing that we have not touched, but we will have some presentations later on, service management as part of it, because a security incident is basically an incident where also the IT team should be aware, and the IT ops team, and maybe you have to trigger a reconfiguration of a system and device, a workload. And if you have a solution and a platform that does this end-to-end security incident on the endpoint is identified, triggers something in service management, and actually is scheduling automatically a change, that's quite powerful. So what we always preach actually is automated attacks, which we see nowadays, need automated defense, right? And that defense is not just isolating then the threat, it's much more about also auditing, learning from it, that the platform learns and can also see if you have that threat in other parts of your business. So that's good. So to wrap this up, Chris, really two more slides, because to step back where we have started, remote work is here to stay, right? It was here before COVID-19, and it has accelerated because of COVID-19. So you need to prepare yourself. We believe self-service in terms of management is important, but security should be built in, as Chris and I mentioned. But also, what I want to lead you to is actually, we believe security and also workspace in general can be used for something good. That's the reason why we have launched a campaign. We call this Digital Workspace for Good. And if you just jump over 2 more slides, Boris, because I think I can't use it anymore. So I don't have control anymore. You shut us off already, Boris. We need 1 more minute.
Wasn't me.
Yeah. So
like, where do I go? What?
Yeah. So if you just go 1 more.
Yes.
So I don't see it. It still says get IT balanced.
No. Does it? Oh. Can you hear me?
It's frozen. Yeah, we can hear you.
But like, okay, it's frozen. Then let me quickly check on what's happening here. Yeah, indeed, it looks pretty much frozen. Let me try to fix this.
But while you're fixing it, I mean, because I anyways wanted to tell the listeners and the viewers, we as Matrix42 offer also obviously solutions that help to guide you through this remote work scenario. So we have launched initiatives like providing you our cloud service for free for several months to help you go through this difficult phase. We've also provided our, let's say, security solutions for personal devices for free for the whole year. So that if you need to protect personal devices, we have a component that helps you there. And last but not least, we have also identity and access management components, which you can use for several months for free during this difficult time. And if you like it, then just talk to us afterwards. And the very last slide, yeah, now you're a little bit
Hold
fast.
on, something happened here. Excuse me, just need to reset that.
When Chris and I actually started to prepare the presentation, we said, well, we want to end this really with some optimism, right? Because it is a challenging time out there. And there's one very useful quote, if you go to
that one.
Yeah. Winston Churchill, never waste a good crisis, right? I mean, we have seen now that things, especially in IT and security, that typically take months and sometimes years, can all of a sudden be approved or even implemented and executed in an organization within days because it's needed. And then the last statement that I want to do here is, I mean, Ayrton Senna, a very famous Formula One race driver, as you know, he once said, you can't overtake 15 cars during sunny weather, but you can if it is raining. And this is actually the optimism that we want to bring in here. You can do now and invest in security and the digital workspace that helps you for long-term success and outperform the competition. So with that, we would, I think on behalf of Chris, we would like to say thank you very much. And of course, please stay healthy, but also stay positive. Yeah.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Boris. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.